All right, so on one hand, the Acaia Orbit, it's doing a lot of things extremely well, bringing a lot of innovation to the table, a lot of crazy features that you don't see in other grinders. But on the other hand, there are some decisions about, how it's made, how it's positioned, all that are a little bit confusing, and it's never totally caught on in the way that a lot of people maybe expected. Now, I think I've actually figured out some of the reason as to why that is. Number one, when Acaia released this grinder, they really pushed the grind by weight feature, and that's cool. But as a single dosing grinder, normally you weigh your beans on the front end, so that didn't totally make sense to a lot of people. The other reasons are a little more complicated, and we're gonna get to them. Now, there's a lot about this grinder that I'm actually a pretty big fan of, actually. It comes in at about $1,700 US, which moves it up into that premium tier of grinders for sure, coming in even a little bit more expensive than a P64, but it is priced kind of in that neighborhood of grinder. And I think when you actually look at what the Orbit does, even though it's more expensive, it is actually bringing, in many ways, a lot more to the table than some of those other grinders. And I would even go as far as to say, this is probably, as far as smarts and smart functionality goes, the smartest coffee grinder that I have actually ever used. Now, as I mentioned, it's a single dosing grinder, meaning you kind of weigh out and grind up one serving of coffee at a time, most of the time. It's also a stepless grinder, meaning that even though it has these ticks on here, it's kind of one smooth adjustment, giving you kind of infinite flexibility between steps to dial in your coffee to whatever degree that you need. This specific one was sent to me by Acaia. It's a new colorway, beige white. I did a collaborative post with them on Instagram to help them announce the new color. No money was exchanged hands as part of that collaboration, and as far as it comes to this review, Acaia hasn't seen it. They don't have any input into it. It's not part of any agreement, and these are my full and honest thoughts about this grinder after using it for several months. Now, the Orbit was designed in collaboration with Weber Workshops. You can see it's very reminiscent of the EG1 in terms of how it looks, and it's actually made in Taiwan. Now, I always like to talk about manufacturing standards and sustainability, and as far as that goes, Taiwan is a great place to manufacture stuff. They have good labor laws, and Orbits are actually made in a family-owned factory that's been operating for over 40 years. Many of their workers have been working there for, 2 to 3 decades even. They align these grinders by hand with several QC checks along the way, and out of the box, this grinder was basically perfectly aligned. More on that later. As far as sustainability goes, wherever possible, they source their raw materials locally, and this is something that I actually really like about the way that Acaia approaches their business. They really stand behind their products over the long term when it comes to repairs and service. So, if a lunar goes down, they will, number one, receive it and repair it and send it back. And even if it's out of warranty, you can order parts from them and fix your scale without having to throw it in the garbage. So I really like that. You can get Orbits in one of 3 colors, and right out of the gate, I was loving the very clean design language, the nice lines of this grinder. Just looks fantastic and feels like a really sharp piece of equipment to have on your counter. It's got this little lid that goes on the hopper just to maintain a really clean visual, a little light that shines down into your dosing cup, not really required, but just like a really nice little touch on there. Compact footprint, it's a nice look. I like it. And you can get the Orbit with one of 3 burr sets from Acaia, a Mazzer 33M, which is a very traditional espresso type burr. You can also get SSP MPs, which is a multi-purpose burr for both espresso and filter, a little bit more of a high clarity burr. And it's also available with SSP Lab Suite or Cast V3, which this grinder is outfitted with. The V3 is an evolution of the SSP Cast V2. That burr worked for both filter and espresso, but it had a little bit of a narrow sweet spot on espresso. The V3 Lab Suite Cast burr has some slight geometry changes, which make it a little bit better suited to espresso brewing than the V2. But I think before we talk about this grinder anymore, we should actually just make a cup of coffee with it. So I have 18 grams of beans weighed out here. So I'm going to take the lid off, turn the grinder on. You can hear it's very quiet, and I'm going to dump my beans in. All right, so one of the smart features there is an auto stop. So obviously the grinder stopped by itself, very convenient. I have the auto stop delay set to max. So once it detects that it's finished grinding, it will wait the maximum amount of time before it turns off. After that, another smart feature, it will do a quick backspin and then purge at a very high RPM to kind of flush out any grinds. Just one issue with those two features and this burr set. My experience has been very often that there is one or two beans kind of just bouncing around in there, not actually having made their way into the burrs. So that means that you don't get your full dose out, and that the next time you turn the grinder on, there's actually a little bit of coffee left in there. So I'll just knock out any retention using this little knocker. And then I'm gonna turn the grinder on, and I can hear that there is one or two beans still in there, even after that long delay, the stop and the purge. So I think there actually was two, maybe even three beans in there that hadn't made their way through after those kind of auto purge features. Just kind of a little annoying, and I think actually a quirk of the way all those features work together in combination with the burrs that are in there. Let's make a cup of coffee. All right, let's see how this tastes. That's a very nice cup of espresso. This is a coffee roasted by Corvus Coffee Roasters. It's actually Costa Rican coffee, Volcan Azul, grown by Alejo Castro. And it's pretty citrus forward actually for an espresso. I'm getting some tropical fruit out of that. Very sweet and cohesive profile in the cup though. Still more clarity certainly than a more traditional espresso burr. Very nice. Definitely no complaints there at all. You know, SSP burrs, they're fantastic, and I think the grinder actually supports those burrs quite well. On filter, I found it was very similar, you know, very integrated cup, not the most clear cup, which I think is actually good for a lot of people. You know, some people like that really crystal clear, a lot of flavor separation in your pour over cups. If that's what you're looking for, I would probably steer you more to the MP burr with this grinder, but the Lab Suites, you know, even the V3, it's a pretty nice cup of pour over. And the way that you saw me use the Orbit just there, you know, I had dialed in my settings ahead of time and basically used it very simply. You know, I often don't have the app out. If you operate the grinder that way, it's really only scratching the surface of what this thing can do. Now, definitely going to talk about all that stuff, but there's also some stuff that might cause you to just discount this grinder entirely and not even consider it. Before we get into any of that juicy stuff though, let's just talk about a couple quick stats. Number one, volume. This grinder, as I mentioned, is very quiet. You know, it comes in under 70 dB, so that's pretty quiet as far as grinders go. As far as grind time goes, it is definitely on the slower end. You know, for an 18-gram cup of espresso, I was finding the grinder would take, you know, 30 seconds to grind most of it, and then those last couple beans, you know, whatever it's working out, that can add almost an extra even like 10 seconds, so 30 to 40 seconds to grind. Then if you have one or two beans bouncing around in there, then, you know, that can add another few seconds to kind of just get that out afterwards. Retention is really good, and part of that is due to the design of how they've actually made the internals. It's a very tight amount of space with these big sweepers that will kind of work everything out. It also has to do with the chute design. Now the chute is kind of one piece, and when you knock it, it vibrates that whole piece, which is very effective at getting any residual grounds out of there. You know, anytime I test a grinder, I really try to make sure the burrs are settled before I make kind of any taste evaluations on them. The best way to do that, and it doesn't always make a huge impact, is actually just grinding a lot of coffee with it. So I ground like 10 kilos of coffee with this before doing my critical tasting stuff. And after that, I took the grinder apart. You know, I did the knocker thing to, you know, knock any retention out of the chute, and there was like nothing in there. So that was really encouraging. And my experience has been basically whatever you put into this grinder, you will get out if you're using the knocker. And if you want to be really sure, avoid static, you know, depending on your humidity and all that, do a spritz of RDT on the beans before they go in there. And that really helps minimize retention. Let's look at where this grinder really moves into a category of its own. In addition to the grind dial right here, this grinder only has one external control, this button right here. There's a lot that this button will do and both show you with multicolor changing LEDs. And my only advice to you if you end up with this grinder is read the manual, because it is definitely not intuitive, all the different functionality that is available in this button, just to walk up and start using it. So you're going to want to go through the manual, get the app, and kind of wrap your head around what all the different colors mean, what all the different warnings mean, what the different presses mean, all that. In a nutshell, there are 3 grinding presets that you can set on here. The first one is white, the second one is blue, and the third one is cyan, and then there's manual mode, which is magenta. Each of those presets you can set in the app and set a specific RPM, as well as target weight if you have a lunar synced up. First press on this button will actually just turn the grinder on. The way it's set up from the factory, 2 quick presses will pulse out a very small amount of coffee. So if you're trying to work your way up to a very specific dose, and 3 presses will purge out any leftover coffee that might be in there, in theory. A 2-second hold will help it to change modes or presets, and a 10-second hold will put it into standby. Now, a lot of that can be changed and tweaked within the app to match your kind of workflow and preference. To get the full Orbit experience, you really do need to use the app. So if you are the type of coffee brewer who you're like, I hate apps, I wish none of my stuff had apps, wish people would stop making apps for stuff, this is probably not the grinder for you. But once you get into the app, you can set all kinds of really cool stuff. You can set the auto purge, the auto stop, how that all works. You can set different RPMs. Even just with that stuff, I don't know any other grinder that has all of that stuff available. But it gets even crazier than that. Number 1, when you are grinding, you can set that target RPM, but it will also show you what the actual RPM is on a little graph, and it will actually compensate what it's doing with the motor in real time to try and get in line with the target you've set. And if you have an Acaia Lunar synced up, it will actually show you that real-time RPM feedback right on the screen. Even cooler than that, you can actually do RPM profiling. And this is a thing before I got the Orbit, I didn't even realize was a thing. Basically, you set a start RPM and a phase time, and then at the end of that phase, it will shift to another RPM for a specific amount of time. And that is just a really cool feature for the people who really like to get in there and tweak stuff and try different things, you know, say, oh, maybe I want to start with a high RPM and then shift to a low, shake it all up, and then see how that pulls a shot of espresso. Really, really cool. And at this point, if you're a crazy coffee nerd, your head is starting to spin with like, oh, I could do this, I could do that. Oh, I could tweak this. Oh, I could try this style of shot. I never thought about that. There's just one issue. And if you're not the type of person who likes to tweak stuff, you could maybe even just ignore this whole section of the video. For coffee geeks who like to mess around with that kind of stuff, there is one part of coffee grinders that they tend to mess around with more than any other part, and that is the actual cutting burrs. Things that actually do the grinding of the coffee. You know, coffee enthusiasts very often will have a couple different set of burrs. Not everybody, but you know, they'll put another set in, sell it. Oh, I'd like to try a different style of cup. Let's try these burrs, see how they work, and really fine tune their coffee experience that way. And on the Orbit, getting the burrs out, you know, if you ever want to try changing them or even just getting in there to clean the grinder out, is a lot more tedious than other grinders that I have reviewed in this kind of segment. Just for example's sake, you know, I'll open this up for you. First thing you need to do are take out 4 screws in the side, and then this assembly kind of slides off. You can see it is very clean in there, not really any real retention to speak of. Now on other grinders, that's at most like a 2-screw setup, or in some cases you can just keep loosening the grind dial and it will come apart that way. And in a lot of those grinders, you would already have 1 burr set in your hand, or at least be able to just kind of pull it out at this point. On the Orbit, there's an additional 4 screws that you need to undo before you can get access to the space between the burrs. So I'm just gonna take those out really quick. And once they're all out, the rotating burr carrier, it's called, comes right out. From there, you can clean the burrs, or, you know, if you want to mess around with a swap, you can give it a shot. There's just one issue. The process of doing that and the way all the different surfaces fit together with all that complexity, every time I would take this grinder apart and then put it back together, the burr touch point would change slightly. The burr touch to burr lock point, that distance would change slightly. And all of those things are indicating that the alignment is changing slightly, which is not a good thing. Now again, if you don't ever plan on changing the burrs in your coffee grinder, then you can kind of ignore this, but a lot of people who are going to be shopping for grinders in this price point are going to be looking at this stuff. But alignment is basically how the burrs are positioned in relation to one another. And particularly with espresso, you really want that alignment to be as close as possible. You know, any kind of tilt or angular difference in how the burrs are positioned can have a negative impact on grind quality and consistency. And on the burr carrier here, there is actually a bit of a unique solution to that problem. See, when you flip this over, there are 3 screws and several other screw holes here. And the way this was originally designed was you could use these screws to kind of push up on the burr from behind to kind of lift it into alignment. This approach is a little bit behind the times. You see, when this thing was designed and announced in 2021, there was really only a couple other 64mm grinders available. There weren't a lot of Burr Options available either. You know, it was a bit of a different day in that, for the most part, whatever burrs a grinder came with tended to be the burrs that people wanted when they bought the grinder. And all of this, you know, burr changing, trying different burrs for different tastes, didn't really come until later. Today, there are a lot more burr options available, and it's a lot more common for people looking in the enthusiast tier, higher price point of grinders to want to consider changing their burr set or having multiple burr sets. You know, back when this was released, anybody who would actually go as far as to do that would tend to kind of shim up their burrs with, you know, little strips of aluminum foil or what they call shim stock. People still do this. And the way that this grinder was made kind of presented a bit of an innovative and clever solution to needing to do that in the same way. Then, once they had that solution, Acaia thought, okay, what are some other really cool features that crazy coffee people might actually want? And they put in, you know, grind by weight functionality, RPM adjustability, all the app functionality, the purging, the pulsing, ramping, all that stuff. The issue is that in the years that followed the Acaia Orbit's release, what manufacturers started focusing on instead was designing carriers that didn't need kind of elaborate solutions to ensure good alignment. And this really opened the doors to people trying more burr sets and that being more of a norm. And even though the Orbit in many, many respects, even still to this day, is kind of ahead of its time in terms of what it offers, the alignment system, as clever as it was, is kind of behind the times in terms of what other grinder manufacturers are offering today. Now, one other thing that I noticed is when I took the static burr carrier off, just kind of pops off here, the backside of this carrier actually didn't have the screws in there. So I'm not sure why that is, but I did find that kind of interesting. The issue remains, if you're trying to self-service this grinder, be it as something as complicated as a burr change or as simple as cleaning your grinder, there are a ton of ways that you can mess up the alignment. You know, every time I've had this grinder apart, something has changed even just a little bit, which is not exactly confidence inducing. So my only assumption is that, you know, you're just not really meant to take this grinder apart. I think it only really becomes an issue if you are planning to get in here, open things up, take it apart, maybe try experimenting with different types of burrs. A couple other little things here as I'm putting this back together. This assembly on the front here that I'm just screwing on. You know, you can put it on and all the screws go in the right place and you can be thinking, oh, this is like just going back together. I'm not thinking about it too much. There is a little bit of a range, even if all the screws are in and it seems like it's in the right place, that it actually isn't in the right place. So the gap between the dial and this piece, you want to be like pushed tight closed as you're putting it back together. Otherwise, what can happen is grinds can actually escape out through the gap underneath the dial and start coming out as you're adjusting the grind. Very confusing the first time it happened to me and annoying. Again, probably never going to happen unless you've taken the grinder apart, which Acaia doesn't recommend. But also, I want to show you something. Plug this back in, turn it on. This piece right here, even just by putting a little bit of pressure on it, you can hear that sound. That's the burr carrier, maybe even the burrs starting to rub against one another. And this is something that you are touching literally every time you use the grinder. And that sound means that the alignment is changing a little bit. Now, when you let the pressure off, it should just spring back to normal. But again, it was good from the factory, and it was really only after I started taking this thing apart and messing with it that a lot of this stuff started rising to the surface. And there are a couple other little things that I feel like I have to nitpick with this grinder too. The counter appeal, I love it. It's probably one of my most favorite grinders to actually just look at and experience as an object. The design language is fantastic. It looks clean. I am a big fan. And it really is a cream white. It's a lot warmer than a lot of my other equipment, which is fine. What kind of throws me off, and I feel like this is a really petty thing to mention, but it surprised me when I got it out of the box, so I'm gonna mention it. This dosing cup is a lot cooler white than the rest of the Orbit. It doesn't match. So, you know, I think to have this clean of a look with this slightly different colored dosing cup is kind of weird. Likewise, the chute extender is black, so it kind of stands out. And there are a couple other little things that stand out on this grinder. You know, these hex screws on the side, they're kind of tucked in there. It looks intentional. What doesn't look intentional is these screws around here, this screw up here. There are a couple under here as well. Just kind of looks a little unfinished, you know? And when you look inside here, you can kind of see the edge of the powder coating. The inside here looks a little raw and unfinished too. Now, the grind by weight feature of this grinder, you know, most of the time I don't actually use that for single dosing. And I think that fact that Acaia led with that feature maybe hurt this grinder initially a little bit, but you do need to get a lunar, which really raises the price overall of this grinder if you don't already have one. And you need to be very careful in how you're applying these strips for it to work. Now, one use case with the grind by weight that I actually did really like a lot was the fact that an Acaia Orion hopper will fit on here. And for me, where I found this really useful is if we have company coming over and I want my nice single dosing grinder that's dialed in already with the beans that I'm using, going to give me the grind quality that I like. I just want to be able to serve my family faster. So I throw on a hopper, I use the grind by weight settings, and everything is fantastic. Another very similar use case could be if you want to do a pop-up. You know, you use this grinder at home, and then when you go to do your pop-up, you convert it into a grind by weight for some workflow gains. Static was more of an issue with this grinder before I ran that 10 kilos of coffee through it. Still is a bit of an issue if you don't use the chute extender or RDT, depending on your relative humidity. And with the chute extender, you know, the space that there is to slide this dosing cup under here is really quite trim. So if you put it in at the wrong angle, you can kind of hit things and cause beans to spill out. So that's a little tight. So I ended up at a bit of a crossroads with this grinder. I actually really like Acaia. I like the way that they run their business. I like the way that they stand behind their products over time. I like the way they send replacement parts and they don't just say, no, you got to throw your thing in the trash. That is a big win for me. And this grinder I also really like. I love the way it looks. I love the experience of using it. I love the way that it feels. I really love the innovation that it brings to the table feature-wise, you know, with some of this more advanced functionality when it comes to, you know, RPM ramping, profiling, customizing it for different use cases. It's really, really great, really innovative. It's expensive, but I think it actually is bringing the value You know, it's a really small, compact footprint, and in many respects, it's actually a couple jumps ahead of any other grinder on the market. And yet, for the people who actually would likely, at least in my experience, want to leverage all of that fine tuning, they're also, in many cases, probably going to want to try different burrs. And doing that, the alignment ramifications of having this thing apart really gets in the way of that. So when I try and answer the question, who is this grinder actually for? I have a couple answers. Number one, you just want a really high quality grinder, and the Orbit design language speaks to you. You want to get a product that you'll be able to take it out of the box. It's going to perform outstandingly. The company is going to stand behind it. It's made somewhere where the manufacturing is not just sold out to the lowest bidder, and the budget isn't a deal breaker for you. And I think in all those cases, the Orbit checks every single one of those boxes. And the second category of people are people who really want those smart features. You know, maybe you want to be able to convert from a single dosing grinder to a grind by weight grinder for your pop-up, or, you know, when you have company over or whatever. You maybe want to play with some of those more advanced RPM profiling features, super cool. Or maybe even just like the auto purge, the auto stop, all of that just kind of sounds like it could round out your workflow nicely, but you don't plan on actually taking the burrs out and trying out different burr sets. I think if that's you, that the Orbit could actually be a great fit. If you want to get a grinder and you're like, yeah, I'm not totally sure on the burrs, but looks good, and you know, maybe I'll throw in a couple different sets before I land on the one that I actually want to use long term, or maybe I want to go between a couple different sets on a somewhat regular basis, you know, not really where the Orbit is positioned, in my opinion. So if you're a coffee enthusiast and that's the type of thing you're looking for, I would probably steer you in another direction. You know, even the way the Orbit is labeled with this badge on the side, it feels very permanent. Like, this is the burr that is meant to be with this grinder. You know, we are discouraging you from getting in there and changing it. So on the whole, I like using it. I like the way it looks. The coffee it makes is fantastic. Am I going to change burrs in it? Probably ever, probably not. So I want you to tell me, is this grinder ahead of its time, behind the times, or both? If you're a coffee geek and you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, you love nerding out on this stuff, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because I'm always trying to uncover really cool stuff when it comes to the world of coffee and coffee equipment. And make sure you drop your thoughts on this grinder and this video down there in the comments. I hope your next cup of coffee is as good as this one, and we'll see you next time.